Most people think being alone means something is wrong with you, but what if the opposite is true? What if the moment you started pulling away was the moment you finally began thinking for yourself? People will call you antisocial, quiet, distant, but they don't realize you're not pulling away from people, you're pulling away from noise. Most people think being alone means something is wrong with you, that you're antisocial, disconnected, maybe even broken. But what if the opposite is true? What if the moment you started pulling away was the moment you finally began thinking clearly? Because here's something no one really talks about. The smarter you become, the harder it is to enjoy things that have no depth. Small talk starts to feel repetitive, noise feels overwhelming, and being around people for too long starts to feel exhausting. Not because you hate people, but because your mind doesn't work the same way anymore. And once that shift happens, you start noticing things you can't unsee. There's a moment that happens quietly. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic realization. No clear turning point, no visible shift. It builds slowly, almost invisibly. You begin to notice that something feels off. Not in a loud way, not in a way you can easily explain, just a subtle feeling that certain environments no longer fit you the way they used to. Conversations feel thinner, noise feels heavier, and being around people, even the right people, starts to drain you in a way it didn't before. At first, it's confusing. You might think you're becoming distant, less social, less open, maybe even broken in some way, because everyone else seems to move through it so easily. They talk, they laugh, they stay engaged for hours, and you start feeling the need to step back. But what's actually happening is something deeper. You're not losing connection. You're gaining awareness, and awareness changes everything. For most of your life, you move with the current. You adjust your tone to match the room. You respond the way people expect. You shape your thoughts so they're easier to accept. It's automatic. You don't even notice it happening. Until one day, you do. You start seeing patterns. How often people speak without meaning anything. How silence makes them uncomfortable. How quickly conversations shift away from anything real. You notice how much of interaction is built on surface level alignment. Not truth, not depth, just comfort. And once you see that, you can't go back to not seeing it. This is where solitude starts to change meaning. It stops feeling like isolation and starts feeling like relief. Because when you're alone, something important happens. Your mind stops adjusting. It stops filtering itself in real time. And suddenly your thoughts begin to stretch. They become longer, clearer, more complete. Instead of reacting, you begin observing. Instead of speaking, you begin understanding. And in that space, your mind does something it rarely gets to do in the outside world. It goes deeper. Intelligent people don't just think faster, they think wider and deeper. A simple idea doesn't stay simple. It branches, it expands, it connects to other ideas, to past experiences, to patterns, to meaning. But that kind of thinking requires something very specific: space. And space is almost impossible to maintain in constant interaction because every interaction interrupts, even small ones. A message, a question, a reaction. Each one pulls your attention outward, and when your attention is constantly pulled outward, your inner world becomes fragmented. You stop thinking in depth, you start thinking in fragments. That's why being alone doesn't feel empty. It feels uninterrupted, like finally being able to hear your own thoughts all the way through. Over time, something else shifts. Your tolerance for meaningless stimulation drops. Things that once felt engaging start to feel repetitive, predictable, even exhausting. You begin craving something else, not more, but deeper. A single meaningful idea starts to feel more satisfying than hours of scattered conversation. A quiet moment becomes more valuable than constant interaction. Not because you don't like people, but because your mind begins to prioritize clarity over noise. And clarity is rare. There's also another layer that's harder to explain. You begin to notice things most people don't: small inconsistencies, subtle emotional shifts. The difference between what someone says and what they actually mean. You pick up on tone, energy, silence between words, and over time, this creates a kind of mental overload because you're not just hearing what's being said, you're processing everything around it. And that takes energy, a lot of it. So solitude becomes necessary, not as an escape, but as recovery, a place where your mind can stop decoding, stop analyzing, stop filtering, and just exist. There's also a shift in how you relate to agreement. At some point, you stop needing it, not in a loud, rebellious way, quietly, internally. You become comfortable holding thoughts that don't match the room. You stop adjusting your perspective just to feel aligned. And that changes how you experience social interaction, because a lot of it depends on subtle agreement. Shared reactions, shared views, shared emotional responses. And when your internal world starts to diverge, staying aligned requires effort. Effort that begins to feel unnecessary. So you become more selective, not because you think you're above anyone, but because you've become more honest with yourself. There's also the way you begin to experience time. It stops being something to fill and becomes something to protect. You become aware of how easily it disappears, how quickly it gets consumed by things that don't actually matter, and once you see that, you start choosing differently. You begin to value moments that give something back, moments that sharpen your thinking, expand your awareness, bring you closer to yourself, and many of those moments happen in solitude. There's also a quiet tension that builds when you're constantly around people, even if you don't notice it immediately. You adjust slightly. A filtered response, a softer opinion, a reaction that's not fully yours. Individually, these things seem small, but over time, they create pressure. Being alone removes that pressure because there's nothing to match, nothing to perform, nothing to edit. It's just you. And for someone who values truth, even internally, that matters more than anything. There's a common assumption that people who spend more time alone are avoiding something, but often they're facing more than most people are willing to, because when distractions disappear, your thoughts don't. They become louder, clearer, more direct. And that's not always comfortable. But intelligent people tend to tolerate that discomfort better. They don't rush to escape it, they explore it. They sit with questions instead of forcing answers. They observe their thoughts instead of suppressing them. And over time, that builds something most people never fully develop: self awareness. There's also a shift in how your mind responds to stimulation. You stop needing constant novelty, you stop chasing distraction. Your attention stabilizes. You become less reactive, more intentional. You start noticing how much of the world is designed to keep you slightly distracted, always scrolling, always reacting, always consuming. And once you become aware of that, you begin to step away from it, not dramatically, quietly. And in that quiet, your mind reorganizes itself. Scattered thoughts begin forming patterns, unprocessed emotions begin making sense. Everything that felt chaotic starts aligning. Even boredom changes. It stops being something you avoid and becomes something you enter. A space where your mind is no longer occupied, but not yet directed. And in that space, curiosity appears. You begin thinking for no reason, exploring ideas without needing a result, following thoughts simply to understand them. And that's where real thinking begins. There's also something else that develops in solitude, something subtle but powerful: self trust. Without constant external input, you begin relying on your own judgment, your own perception, your own understanding. At first, it feels uncertain, but over time, it becomes stable. You learn to stand inside your own thinking without immediately questioning it. And that creates a kind of quiet confidence. Not loud, not visible, but unshakable. Your pace changes too. You stop rushing, stop reacting instantly, stop filling every moment just to avoid stillness. And in that slower rhythm, something deeper appears: reflection. Reflection doesn't look productive, but it's where understanding is built. Without it, life becomes noise. With it, life becomes meaning. And eventually, something shifts completely. You stop seeing solitude as something you do and start experiencing it as something you return to, a baseline, a reset, a place where your mind becomes clear again. And from that clarity, everything changes. You stop chasing attention, stop needing constant interaction to feel real, stop depending on others to define your state. You become enough for yourself. And that's where the real transformation happens. Because once you feel peace in your own presence, you stop looking for it everywhere else. You stop tolerating shallow connections, stop shrinking your thoughts, stop performing just to belong. Instead, you wait for something real. And yes, that means you'll spend more time alone. But that time isn't empty. It's where you rebuild yourself, where your thinking sharpens, where your emotions settle, where your identity becomes clear, and slowly, you become someone who is no longer controlled by noise. You walk into the world differently, calmer, more grounded, more precise. You don't react to everything. You don't chase everything. You choose. And in a world full of constant motion, that kind of stillness becomes power. So when people ask why smart people prefer being alone, they're missing the point. It's not about preference. It's about what happens when you finally see clearly, when you realize how much of the world is noise and how little of it is actually yours. Because once you hear your own thoughts, really hear them, you stop trading them for distraction. And once you feel peace in silence, real peace, you stop trying to replace it with anything else. So, no, they're not alone because they have less. They're alone because they've found something most people are still searching for, a mind that doesn't need constant input, a sense of self that doesn't need approval, a kind of peace that doesn't disappear when everything gets quiet. And once you have that, something unexpected happens. Silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling like home. And in that moment, when there is no noise, no performance, no distraction, just you fully present, fully aware, you realize something most people never do. You were never avoiding the world. You were learning how to exist in it without losing yourself. And that is why you don't fear being alone anymore. Because you finally understand something deeper than loneliness. You understand freedom. Don't forget subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications.